friends, my name is Elizabeth, and today we are talking about tropes. Bad tropes, more specifically, and how to write them well. We're going to take these bad tropes and make them good again. First of all, not all tropes are bad. Sometimes tropes in fiction are necessary and delicious, and part of the reason why a reader might seek out a book to read in the first place. Tropes can be helpful in grounding the reader in a specific genre, or in piquing their interest, or any number of other things. Good things. But tropes go bad when they are done poorly, or when they are overdone. That's when they turn into cliches. And readers don't get excited about cliches. Instead, they're like, ugh, not again. The villain is the hero's father. Those are the types of tropes we're talking about in this video, including that one specifically. How do we take the bad tropes and write them well? Make them invigorated again? Because surely they're not just off limits forever now. This is my argument and I am sticking to it. Alright, first small caveat. Pretty much none of this applies if you're writing humor or satire. Okay? All the rules are different or opposite if you're writing humor or satire. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about good old-fashioned literature. I'm just kidding. Humor is literature. That was a joke, okay? Alright, here we go. The first bad trope that we will be talking about is the love triangle. We all know people hate this one. They're tired of it, and they're very vocal about that. Typically, the complaints about a love triangle, besides being overdone, are that it's obvious from the beginning who the protagonist is going to end up with romantically. There's no tension there, so all of the scenes with the second love interest just end up feeling like bloated filler. And every time the protagonist is like, who will I choose? The audience is just rolling their eyes and questioning the intelligence of everyone involved, including themselves. But there was a time when books with love triangles were extremely popular. All the rage. Did we love the trope back then simply because it was less common? Because it wasn't yet a cliche? Or is there actually a way to include the love triangle trope in your book in a way that is beneficial or even necessary for the story? And the answer is yes, and here's why. First, I'll show you an example, and then I will tell you the nitty-gritty reasons as to why the love triangle works in this story, and how you can include a successful triangle in your story. So, let's talk about the Hunger Games. Although polluted by Team Gale and Team PETA rhetoric in the media, I would argue that the love triangle is an essential aspect of that story, since it shows the reader, rather than tells them, one of the essential dilemmas that Katniss faces in the story. As a character, will she fully embrace the anger that has been propelling her up to this point in the story, and choose Gale, that she has relied upon for her survival? Or will she choose healing and growing beyond anger and choose PETA? Or, an actual possibility in this love triangle, will she choose neither? That's usually not really a possibility in most love triangles, but it is in this one, which makes it a little bit better. And in this love triangle, none of the answers are right or wrong. It's not a question of right or wrong. It's simply a character question. What will Katniss, as a character, choose in the final moments of her character arc in this story? Anger or healing? Healing makes it seem like that one is more right than the other one. But it's not about right and wrong. Those are just her options as a character. You know, the culmination of her character arc could end in these different ways. And it's showcased by the love triangle. You know, it's what the whole story has been about. Not the love triangle, but the choices that Katniss can make to either, spend her life relying on this anger for survival and box everybody out, or risking trust in another person and overcoming anger as her primary motivator. The love triangle is a natural way to showcase that choice. Do you see? It makes sense. It just works. I promise. Shadow and Bone does do this to a lesser extent, perhaps less successfully. Because even though there is a similar dynamic set up between Alina and her love interests as to whether she would choose her good side or her bad side, it doesn't really work because many reasons, one of them being, by and large, audiences of that story viewed the Darkling as the romantic interest, and the other romantic interests as just some guy. And I think the reason for that is because it wasn't so much a character question, because the story was set up in such a way and relied upon romantic tropes that the story overall felt more like a romance than a character study. Not that romance is bad, but it's just that love triangles in romance tend to fall flat. While the Hunger Games felt more focused on Katniss as a character and her choices, rather than trying to align with specific tropes of the romance genre, like having the romantic hero and the rival. Gale and PETA don't serve those purposes in the story. They serve the purpose of showing, a personified view of Katniss's anger or Katniss choosing to trust. And I think that's kind of where Shadow and Bone falls flat. The use of the love triangle in that book feels like it's a romance trope rather than supporting any kind of character arc or journey. Not that romance tropes are bad, that's not what I'm saying. I enjoyed Shadow and Bone, and I like romance. But to me, the love triangle felt like it was included as a trope in romance, rather than as an integral narrative choice that would define Alina's character. You know what? Bad trope number 2. The perfect protagonist with just one flaw. This is a classic symbol of bad writing. You've got your hero, he's gorgeous, he's smart, he's strong, but he's afraid of snakes. Aha, see, it can be done well, you know, the perfect protagonist with only one flaw. It has been done well, and I think, again, that is part of the problem. It is overused. And unless it's done intentionally and with the right combination of traits with the one flaw, then you may end up writing the classic example of a Mary Sue, or a Gary Sue. You know, she's gorgeous, she's strong, she's smart, but she's clumsy. That's a character that tends to annoy people because it doesn't feel intentional. It feels like the author was just trying to write the perfect character, perhaps themselves perfectified, and then was like, oh wait, to make them relatable, I will give them a flaw. I will make them clumsy. And then like an evil fairy in a Grimm's Brothers tale, you bestow upon the character clumsiness, and then wipe your hands of her. Don't do that. I actually think this character could work if you've created a story where the climactic moment requires the protagonist to tiptoe across the rickety beams of a collapsed bridge in the middle of a thunderstorm in order to save her one true love, and the whole time she's battling her clumsy, floppy muscles. That could be interesting. But anyway, another example of this trope working successfully is Robert Langdon in the Robert Langdon series by Dan Brown, including The Da Vinci Code. In that series, Robert Langdon is a genius. He's brave, he's handsome, but he's claustrophobic. His one flaw. In some of the novels, that comes into play during the climactic finales, but sometimes it doesn't, and that's fine. They're still some of the best-selling novels of all time. And the reason they work is because Robert Langdon isn't trying to be a complex character who evolves over time, goes on an internal journey throughout the books. Robert Langdon exists to be the one perfect guy who can solve these mysteries. He's a symbologist, he's an expert historian, he's adventurous, and he's not tied down by responsibilities. And people don't read the books to know more about Robert Langdon. They read to know more about secret societies and hidden treasure. That's the fantasy of those books. That's why they work. Not imagining yourself as a complex, well-rounded Robert Langdon. Most people don't even know who Robert Langdon is, but most people do know what the Da Vinci Code is. Bad trope number 3. Everyone is connected to the hero. This is another one that has been done well in the past, but has been so overdone that it is now a cliché. But even before it was overdone, this trope still had one major drawback. When everyone is connected to the hero, the world that you've created, the world of your story, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, you can really write yourself into a corner. Your vast fantasy world is no longer so vast. You end up with just a few people in 1 or 2 families, being literally everybody in the book. And that's not a world. That's an apartment building. And all the twists and turns in your story become easier to guess because the bad guy is either going to be the hero's long-lost brother or biological father or mad scientist aunt. There is no tension there when the reader can guess that everybody is connected to the hero in some way. I think an interesting way to do this trope would be to do it intentionally. As in, to intentionally have your protagonist start to see his world getting smaller and smaller and smaller because everybody he meets is connected to him already in some way. And so the story has that terrible, uncovering a conspiracy type of feeling. Until the very end, when the character realizes that his whole world is this terrible Truman Show-like experience. No way out. Since everyone is connected to everyone else. I couldn't think of an example that does this well off the top of my head, but I just think that would be neat. You know, a story where the world intentionally gets smaller and smaller and smaller because everybody's connected, and then you realize everybody has always been connected and my world has all been plotted out before me and there's no way for me to get out. That just sounds cool to me, you know? Write that story or tell me about that story because I want to read it. Bad trope number 4. Prophecies. Why are prophecies so roundly disliked these days in the publishing world? They have been done extremely successfully in fiction for centuries. Literally, Shakespeare was doing the prophecies and doing it well. And maybe that is why nobody wants prophecies these days, but it's also possible that narratively, they do something to a story that kind of overall reduces the tension. Like, a prophecy does kind of spoil the ending of your book. Obviously, there are many examples of highly successful stories with prophecies in them. But rather than use those when you're writing as an example of how to write a prophecy, I think perhaps you should view them more almost as like a time before prophecies were overdone. So instead, if you want to include a prophecy in your story, you should really work to twist the trope somehow. Like maybe the prophecy was translated incorrectly before the book even began, so they're on this quest to fulfill this prophecy or to stop the prophecy, and it turns out they were doing it all wrong. I don't know if that would be frustrating for the reader or not. Maybe the prophecy turns out to be a scheme laid out by the villain, who had a long history of villainous ancestors, who created this prophecy with the sole intention of leading people off track, or luring them into a trap. That could be really interesting. But I'm also feeling a little bit hesitant about suggesting you even try doing that in your book, simply because the setup of this type of prophecy would still be hard to do. Like, it'd still be a hard sell to your reader, that initial, identification of a prophecy being in your book, no matter how much you turn it on its head. Like, how do you set up your prophecy, even with all of its new and inventive angles, without first turning off readers just don't want a prophecy? It's a catch-22 with this one. And I'm not sure what the answer is. You do want to make sure that you're twisting the trope enough. Like, maybe the reason the prophecy worked in Harry Potter was not necessarily because Harry Potter was created, several decades ago, and is now essentially old. But because it wasn't really just a prophecy about how to defeat Voldemort. In reality, the prophecy in that book was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, it wasn't the world-ending prophecy that it pretended to be. Because if Voldemort hadn't cared so much about the prophecy, that he set out to stop it from coming true by trying to kill Harry Potter as a baby, then the prophecy probably wouldn't have come true. I don't know. Maybe turning a magical mystical prophecy into a self-fulfilling prophecy is still overdone? I don't know. It's your call. I think the key here would be to find a way to set up the prophecy in such a way that intrigues the reader, rather than having to wait to show the reader that you've turned the trope on its head after the prophecy has already been established. That'll be the trick. I wish I had an example, but I don't. Also, another bad trope that kind of goes hand in hand with the prophecy is the chosen one. And readers tend to dislike chosen ones, because it can lead to lackluster character development and backstory. Like, who cares if this guy is actually worthy of carrying an entire plot on his shoulders? He's the chosen one! That's not great. I also think a lot of times writers want to include the chosen one because it does kind of imbue a story with this righteous sense of purpose that can be really satisfying to experience as a reader. But maybe it would be better to create that experience through a complex, highly motivated protagonist who isn't chosen for the journey, but instead chooses it himself, along with all of the struggles and trials that come with it. But that's just me. I get why all of these tropes are tropes. Obviously, not only have they been done well in the past, there's also something uniquely delicious about them. A story imbued with purpose and prophecy and unanswerable questions about love and family and who do I know and who's turning its back on me. It all works in a story, and it can be really fun to revel in a story like that, to just, lay down in the fantasy of it. I get it, and I think there are ways to make it work where you're not necessarily just trying to craft the entire opposite of the trope in order to turn it on its head, which can feel also a little bit overdone. But instead, you're intentionally crafting a story in which the trope is not a trope, but is actually a necessary component of the narrative. You don't want the Da Vinci Code bogged down by some complex narrator on an internal journey. That's not why the readers are there, and the author understands that. You don't want to miss out on showing Katniss's choice of her internal growth through her love interests by just simply not having love interests. Then the story is missing something. That's the idea with the tropes. It's not so much trying to find a way to twist them and make them original. It's trying to write a story in which the tropes are a necessary component. That's the goal. That's the trick. That's the trouble.